Looking at chapter 6 now with arrays, and so you can see here just a little brief note on arrays. You want to manage large amounts of data. Look to use one variable as opposed to creating like maybe a million different variables. If we have a million different int values, we can create one array of ints and let it hold on to a million different values at once. Keep track of them through indexing them. And luckily, we have some experience with this. Strings are actually arrays of characters in a sense. So the numbering system we're comfortable with, we index beginning with 0. The last item is always found at the length -1. We'll notice a couple of differences. For example, arrays actually have a final int that belongs to them called length, as opposed to strings, which use a length method. This is a variable, so we won't put parentheses on the end of it. I'll give you some examples of that in a minute. You can put primitive data into arrays, so we can declare them as int type or double, boolean. And we could also create arrays out of strings or any other type of object. Um, when we have an array, we use keyword new to create one. I'm going to show you an alternate approach to that as well. But one of the ways to create an array is through the keyword new. And when we do this, we're giving the array a specified length. So you'll notice right here that I've created a new array of doubles. One of the big things you want to do anytime you learn something new like this is just kind of master the syntax. So notice the way that I've written that expression there, new double 8. That's going to create an array of doubles that hold 8 values, indexed 0 through 7. And then when you create that array, originally it would fill everything as a 0.0. So right after this line of code, there would be a variable named numbers capable of holding an array of doubles. The double array handed to it has room for 8 values, and all of them would be set to 0.0. Unfortunately, that deal with the length is kind of non-negotiable. So once you create this array to hold on to 8 numbers, if you got a 9th number, you wanted to add it to the array, it wouldn't really work that way. Either you have to replace one of the existing numbers, lose it, or if you wanted it to hold the 9th number, you'd have to create a brand new array. And then you could assign it back to this variable, but the previous array would have to be gotten rid of at that point. This is another way to create an array. You notice, kind of like we've done with variables before, I've declared ages to be a variable that's capable of holding an array. And then later, I actually assigned a new array to it. And this would be an integer array with 5 values. Those would all default to 0. So you'll notice it's kind of weird. You can put these brackets like in between the declaring type and the name of your array, or they can come after. They can be attached or not. Like it's really kind of bizarre almost how Java allows like different ways of writing the syntax out. But the bottom line is you got to put those brackets in there somewhere. They can either touch the variable name or the type. They can be between the two or after. Like I said, it's a little strange that it works both ways, but here I've actually smushed it all down and not put any spaces. Here I've put it on the left side of the variable name. I don't really even know what to tell you in terms of like what's the most common way to do it. I don't really see a difference when you look at other people's code. Different people just seem to declare arrays differently. Okay, that's about all I can really say. Here I've made an array of strings. Okay, that hold 3 strings, and here I've made an array of bike rides. Now that's pretty peculiar. So notice that you can have object typed arrays, and they would get set to null originally. Null is different than 0. It's different than the empty string. The saying null. So that's true with our string array here also. Bike ride is just some class that I made up. So a bike ride has like a mileage, like how far you went, elevation gain. So, did you go up or down? How long did it take you to ride? And then a name can be given to it as well. And it's got some various constructors, accessor methods, modifier methods. I gave it a toString. So just a pretty basic class, just to give you some examples of how we could create an object-based array as we look through here. Okay. Again, notice how that link that says it's established at the time of the creation and cannot be changed. Remember, I mentioned that like you had an array of 8 doubles, you couldn't add a ninth double to it. You'd have to create a brand new array. So once you get the general hang of how to create an array, there's actually another way to do it. You can use something called an initializer. So an initializer list replaces that like new int that we see right here. And so instead of just saying I want an array that's this big and letting it fill with default values, in an initializer list, if you know the values ahead of time, you can go ahead and just specify them. So right here, this would also create an array of length 5, okay? But instead of just putting 5 zeros in, this would have 5 values. So the values array would actually hold on to those 5 numbers. And like I mentioned a little bit earlier, you think just back to like our strings, the indexes that belong to this array, just like strings, would start at 0, okay, and then go across 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's a length 5 array, okay, but it's indexed 0 through 4. That last index is always going to be 1 less than the length. And I also used an initializer list here to create a string array. Okay, so I put actual strings into the array. And here I did a little bit different. This is kind of nice if you ever need to create an anonymous array. Like, so if you wanted to create an array built to return or to give a new value to an existing array variable name, so this kind of works to do two things at once. It initializes an array and gives the values. A good one to look at here is look at the coding bat in array 1 called make pi and see if you can try creating like a one-line solution using this technique. I'll show that to you later. All right. So once you have these arrays, very often you're going to want to access the values that are in there, right? You know, retrieve the values so that you can use them for whatever purpose was desired, or you might want to modify. And so using square brackets is kind of the key to being able to access or modify elements of an array. So right here, I just said, you know, let me see the value in the values array at index 1. If you remember, this was the values array, index 1. We see an 8 right there, and we see an 8 printing first right there. And when I retrieve those values, since they're declared as integers, I could treat them as integers. So anything I've been able to do with an integer before, I can still do now with these array values. So this would retrieve those two values found at indexes 1 and 2. In this case, it's an 8 and a -2. And then that's just our basic multiplication symbol. And so that's why you see -16 right here. That was the result of 8 times -2. All right, here we see I'm using the length of the values array. Well, like I mentioned, it's a little different. I know this is probably looks a little weird because, you know, if this was a string, we'd be using the length method. We'd have parentheses at the end. But this was not a string. This was an array. It's actually a variable that belongs to it. So we don't put parentheses on it. And I know it's confusing. Just got to get used to that syntax. And you can see that it retrieved the number 5 right there. And that 5 was because there was 5 elements in our values array, indexes 0 through 4. Here I printed names.length. Okay, there's 4 strings in that array. That's where that 4 came from. Here I printed numbers 3, which, okay, this is a little bit mysterious because remember the numbers array, I never put values in it, okay, but it does actually have 8 values. They were all set to the default value given to doubles, 0 0.0. So as of now, that hasn't changed, so we would see 0 0.0. In a second, we'll look at how we could modify those values and put in our own values, and then maybe something else would got to be a little bit careful with those null pointers. So any string array or object-based array, if you just create it, it will default all of its values to null. And so, for example, if you remember earlier, I made a bike ride array and I have it at length 2. If I retrieved either value from this rides array, I would get 0. In my word list, length 3, if I retrieved any of the 3 values from word list, I would get null. And you can see I did that here, and that's where those 2 nulls came from. Now, if I were to go ahead and retrieve the string from the names array, that's a little bit different. So the names array has actual strings in it. One of those strings is named is the string Karen. So here, when I retrieved word list 2, names 2, that gave me back the string Karen. Okay, and that's what we see printing right there. And remember right here, I got back null. Null is not a string. It's just like a way to not really assign any memory there and still hold on to that variable and what it's doing at this point. So it's just a value given to a variable, really like in a sense before it's been initialized. So here's the difference between null and some other string. If you get a string value back and it's set to null, you gotta be really careful. You can't apply any type of string method to that. So the length method, substring, index of, you name it. If I tried applying any type of method to this string, which is not really a string, it's a null pointer, I'm going to get a null pointer exception. So we'll see. I had that line commented out earlier so that I wouldn't get an error. Uh, right here, now I got a null pointer exception at line 84. So I've got to turn this off. And we just comment here that this is a null pointer exception. So if you do retrieve something back that's null, you can't apply any type of method to. Same thing would have happened had I tried to apply a bike ride method on this rides one object. Now the Karen string is a little different. Like see right here, I'm taking the length of the Karen string and I'll get back 5 and I won't get a null pointer exception because there's actually an initialized string in there. And again, this is different than sometimes I think students think that the null is the same as the empty string, but they're not the same. If I initialize this to an empty string, that's a length 0 string. So what it's actually printing there right now is 0 because it's now a length 0 string. We don't see Karen here because I changed it to the empty string. It's not a space character. If you put a space character there, that's going to give you back length 1. So the empty string is a length 0 string, but it's not a null. No, so I know it's confusing, but you have to understand that those are different things. All right, modify 1D arrays. So the 1D, by the way, right now everything we're doing is one dimensional. So think of like an x-axis versus like an xy plane. There's just one dimension. Your arrays are just indexed from 0 to some number. Later on in this course, we're going to work with two-dimensional arrays. We'll have values going across in rows and values going down vertically through columns. We'll have to have like two subscripts, two dimensions find our values. But today it's just one. So if I go to the numbers array and I say I want numbers 3 to be 2.34, you might remember earlier when we saw numbers 3, it was a default value of 0, 0.0. Okay. And so now I'm saying I would like to change that. So you're allowed to assign new values into an array. You just have to say where they're going. So I have to say, like, I'm going to index 3 with this. And when I do that, if I later retrieved it, it wouldn't be 0, 0.0 anymore. Now it would be 2.4 or whatever value. And the names array, which was built to hold strings, I can put a string. And so earlier, names 2 was a null. Oh, sorry, actually it was Karen, and then I changed it to be an empty string. Now it would be Brian. Okay, and so we see these things printing out right here. And I can also say like ages 3 equals nums 1. As long as they're the same type, which in this case they are, they're both integer arrays, then that's fine. And then we get the 9 right here because that was the value given to nums 1. Next one was at 9, right? And so you can try modifying your arrays this way. If I didn't put any brackets here, this would be an error. Okay, you have to say like where it's going. You can't just kind of throw a number into an array. So an array, since it's indexed, if you want to change it, you need to say which index. And brackets are the key. All right, and here's just a little bit more on that object-based array. Now I went ahead and created some bike rides. And I did that by using the bike ride constructor that's expecting a string. Since I'm only initializing the string, then all of those numbers would just get set to 0. And so I've taken those bike rides and I've gone ahead and I've modified the rides array. So the rides array doesn't accept strings, it doesn't accept integers, it doesn't accept doubles, it only accepts bike rides. So it's kind of a two-step process. First, I had to create the bike ride object from the bike ride constructor, and then I had to give it to the array. I could have done this all at once. I could have taken this object right here and just put it straight in, to the array. So as long as I have a valid bike ride object, I could do this. We would call this an anonymous object. I didn't bother to name it ride one. I never gave it a name, but it still is a valid bike ride. Okay. What I couldn't do, what would be illegal, is if I tried to just like take this string here, Mount Wilson Trail, and put that. So if you just tried to put in a string, that's illegal. The bike ride array is built to hold bike rides. Okay. So the rides array, which is type bike ride, can only accept valid bike ride objects. You can only create a valid bike ride object by using the keyword new. There's no way to sidestep that. Okay. So now I've got my bike rides in there and I'm going to print out rides 0. So this is going to go to the toString of the bike ride class, which I wrote earlier, and it's going to print it out for us. Okay, so it printed out rides 0, and we saw that right here. And we can see all those zeros going in through the default settings. Well, bike rides are mutable because I put in some modifier methods, and I can set the mileage and the elevation gain and the time and any of these instance variables here that I want. Okay, so if I take those bike ride references, now the key is I have to say which one. There's 2 bike rides that belong to the rides array. I say, well, let's take ride 0 and let's set its mileage, its elevation gain, its time. Then I'll set those properties that belong to it. Okay, mutating the object found at that index. It just turns out that there's 2 bike rides. Okay, so I could grab either one and do whatever I wanted. Here I chose the one that was at index 0, and notice that when I printed it the second time, it put in the mileage, the elevation, the time, and all that stuff. Okay, just I had to say which one. And you got to be a little bit careful when you start working with these indexes, just like we've seen with strings. Okay, you can go out of bounds. So arrays have indexes starting at 0, and they go up to the length -1. And just like we've seen with strings, if you want to get the last item from an array, you specifically go to that index found at length -1. So if we revisit the names array just real quickly, there's a few names in there: Fred, Sue, originally this is Aaron, Tom, and then we changed Karen to Brian. Well, the first and last strings are Fred and Tom. And you can see how I access those here by accessing the name found at index 0 and the one at names length -1. Now, just like we've seen with strings, if you go too far, so for example, let's say you tried to access the name found at names.length, now you're going to get an index out of bounds exception. And same exact error message, well, not quite, I shouldn't say the same exact, but very similar would happen if I put like -1 here, or perhaps had I put 5 or 6 or 7. It's just going to change this number. And it's going to tell me that I had an index out of bounds exception, in line 119. So we got to be careful that we only try to access valid indexes that belong to the array. The valid indexes start at 0 and go up to the length of the array. And just like with strings, you could have a length 0 array. So sometimes you could be tricked into something a little weird. I really recommend practicing your code, obviously, and I think you'll find some great practice on the Practice It site. I recommend these exercises here, or pretty much anything from the Coding That Java Array 1 section. The last couple rows make it a little too tricky, but for the most part, they're pretty manageable. I think you can do almost that entire section, and you really got to practice your syntax. Just got to learn where to put the brackets, dot length, just little things like that. Just over and over and over again is going to make it easy.